Thank you for joining us, and good morning, good afternoon, and good afternoon, everyone. And we welcome you as part of the community of practice on water and open government. And this is our second webinar session looking at water and sanitation through a gender lens. Just so that we are on the same page, I would take you through the webinar format. My name is Tasneem Bala Sinorwala, and I work with the Water Integrity Network. I'm also a part of the coordination team that works around the community of practice, along with other organizations who I will introduce you to in due course. To let you know, we are right now in the welcome and the introduction of the community of practice, and we move on to session 1, which is composed of 3 presentations. One is from Barbara Schreiner from the Water Integrity Network. We have Alison Merchant, who's going to present. She's with the OGP. And we have Kanika Thakkar from the Stockholm International Water Institute, who will present to us as well. This will be followed by a Q&A session of 10 minutes where we invite participants to ask questions to the presenters, and you will all see a very charming chat box in front of you. So in the course of the presentations, please feel free to write your questions, address it to presenters if you want to, and we will be collecting them and we'll be filtering them. Because of the restrictions of the time and the format, we will try to address as many questions as possible, but we will also find a way, if we are unable to do so, to come back to you if you give us your contact email address and start a conversation around that. After the first Q&A session, we move on to session 2, which is a panel discussion moderated by Barbara Schreiner. And here we'll be joined by 2 panelists. That's Carla Flores from Carta Critica, Mexico, and Tamar Hairikian, I hope I got it right, also from a Mexican-based organization, and we'll be joined by the other presenters as well. It would be about for 30 minutes, and then we have another Q&A session for 10 minutes. So I hope this is clear in terms of the format and what is coming to you and add to you through the webinar. And with that, I would like to move on and give a quick introduction of the Water and Open Government community of practice. For those who don't know us, in 2017, 4 organizations, the Stockholm International Water Institute, World Resources Institute, Fundación Avina, and Water Integrity Network, we came together to form a community of practice to work around the OGP in strengthening and pushing for water and sanitation reforms. Last year, we received a small grant from the Multi-Donor Trust Fund supported by the World Bank, which has allowed us to upscale certain activities and also initiate other activities, and the webinar series is part of that. I need to mention also that the community of practice is very thankful to the Open Government Partnership Support Unit, it's true to their name, and they've been extremely supportive in all our activities of the community of practice, including hosting this webinar today. Why the Open Government Partnership? Because as water actors, we have been active in different international arenas and realms, but we do think that the process of co-creation of 2-year action plans and the active civil society or the citizen engagement that it entails in shaping government policy is a treasure of opportunity to push for water and sanitation reforms. This, we believe as a community of practice, would help strengthen institutional capacity of actors, OGP actors, to deliver water and sanitation, coordinate or facilitate coordination between stakeholders, including initiating that coordination between stakeholders, and resolving information asymmetries. Our goal is not literally speaking, but marrying both the water and open government experts, facilitating knowledge sharing, also developing cross-sectoral approaches to improving water and sanitation services, and most importantly, mobilizing actions that help realize the human right to water and sanitation. What we plan to do, and we've already started, is to create a help desk that would help OGP actors, government and civil society alike, with technical information so that they can build more transformative commitments in water and sanitation, produce materials that inform not only water actors about the OGP process, but also OGP actors on the nuances of water governance and integrity, including sanitation, of course. And then organizing learning events and strengthening network and coalitions at the international, national, and regional level, pushing for water reforms. In due course, we make our presence felt through different events. We've organized our own events in the last year. We also have periodic publications, the newsletter, which informs the community of practice and the OGP community what activities we're undertaking or what information we'd like to share with them. And we also have blog entries that share stories of water commitments, transformative water commitments, or the process of water commitments that have happened in this time. We are around 75 members for the moment, and we, of course, would like to invite more of you to join us and bring in your expertise, your experience, participate in our events, share water tools and resources, and also help us in developing commitments and implementing them, and identifying opportunities where we can have better engagement or stronger engagement between the water and the open government actors. I said it's going to be brief, but I hope you get a sense of what the community practice is about. If you have any questions, we have our email here, but we'll also post a link at the end of the session, so you can contact us in case you need more questions and you have other clarifications. I will now invite Barbara Schreiner to share with us key highlights and sticking points on gender and water and sanitation. I'll introduce Barbara to you. She is WIN's Executive Director since 2019, and she has over 20 years of experience in water and natural resources management in developing countries, with a focus on good governance and addressing poverty and inequality, including gender and other forms of marginalization. She's worked for over a decade in senior management positions in the public sector, including as ministerial advisor on water. She's written extensively on issues of water governance, poverty, and gender. And with that, Barbara, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to everybody, or good morning, wherever people are around the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about gender, water, and sanitation. And I'm sure there are a number of people listening in who know a fair amount about these topics, but it always helps to focus the mind when you're going into a discussion of this nature. So just starting with some of the kind of critical issues around gender, water, and sanitation, I think one of the first things is that every day across the world, women and girls spend around 200 million hours, that's nearly 23,000 years, collecting water. That's the time that gets wasted by women and girl children having to collect water on a daily basis, time that could be used for all sorts of other purposes if they didn't have to fetch water. The other thing I think about gender and water and sanitation is that we have to recognize that women and girls have specific water and sanitation needs because of menstrual hygiene requirements, pregnancy requirements, and because very often they are the family healthcare providers. At the same time, if we look on the irrigation and agricultural side of things, women make up 43% of the agricultural labor force in developing countries and 2/3 of the world's 600 million poor livestock keepers. So if one's looking at water for small livestock, for example, it is actually about providing water to women farmers. The other thing that I think has been much talked about and that one has to recognize is that very unfortunately, women and girls are vulnerable to physical and sexual violence when they're collecting water or using shared toilet facilities. Across the world, it's a reality that women and girl children are exposed in this way. Unfortunately, equally, the fact that women and women-headed households are often the most economically marginalized mean that they don't necessarily have the money available to be able to actually pay for water and make their own arrangements for getting water, which means often that the water that they do get hold of is often more substandard or further away. And where sanitation is not effectively provided in schools, and you have girls who are menstruating, it actually quite often means either that they miss substantial parts of school, staying home during menstruation, or that they actually drop out of school. And that's important when one realizes that an extra year of primary school boosts the women's wages by anywhere between 10 and 20%, and the same, an extra year of secondary school boosts their wages by 15 to 25%. So if one's looking at economic development, the issue of poor sanitation at schools is a particular issue that one needs to look at around economic development. And having said all that, the reality is also that in many places, women are not consulted about the provision of water and sanitation services. It's largely men making decisions about these matters. And the specific needs of women, whether it's for family needs, for their health needs, for irrigation, etc., are often given low priority by the predominantly male managers and decision makers. And in order to be able to get access to water, particularly in the face of the economic marginalization that I was talking about, women and girls often have to pay bribes. I'm not saying that they're the only ones. Men often have to pay bribes as well. But there is a particular issue that women and girl children face, which is the issue of sexual extortion or sextortion, where they are required to pay those bribes through sex or sexual favors. The Water Integrity Network works very much in the area of corruption and failures of integrity. And one of the challenges of corruption and mismanagement is that they shrink public revenue, they reduce the amount that is available to be spent on water and sanitation, they mean that expenditure goes into inappropriate projects, and they push up the cost of services and lower the quality of services provided. All of this serves to undermine the welfare of poor women and children in particular, who are highly dependent on services provided by the state and the public services that are provided. Understanding the linkages between corruption, between accountability, between good governance and gender is absolutely critical if we want to counter the marginalization of women in relation to water and sanitation services. And obviously, there is actually a lot that we can do. And if one's looking into the framing of trying to develop open and accountable government, one can look at 4 critical elements: transparency, accountability, participation, and anti-corruption. And what does this mean in terms of the issues of gender, water, and sanitation? Well, firstly, in terms of transparency, one should be able to monitor and report on the involvement of women in decision-making around these services and consultation around services, but also very much on access to water and sanitation by women, so that one can understand whether women are actually getting the services that they need. Use and reporting on of gender budgeting, where gender budgeting actually looks at a budget and specifically identifies how much of the budget is going towards meeting the needs of women-headed households, girl children, and ensures that actually they are properly provided for in budgets. On the issue of accountability, decision makers should be held accountable for implementing gender-inclusive approaches and for addressing the specific water-related needs of women and girl children. And there are a number of ways of holding decision makers accountable, but they should be held accountable specifically against gender targets and indicators. In terms of participation, we need to be able to create platforms for participation that deliberately enable women to articulate their own needs and aspirations. And in some places, that might actually require, even now in 2020, that there are separate spaces for women to be able to articulate their needs where they are not comfortable to speak in mixed groups. But it needs to be specifically designed so that women can actually participate and participate actively. Women need to be involved in the analysis of how activities, decisions, and plans affect women and girls differently from men and boys. There's a lovely phrase which I think originally came out of the disability movement, which is nothing about me without me. Decisions affecting women in terms of water and sanitation should not be made without their participation. But in order to achieve this, we need to train people in technical and managerial positions and raise their capacity so that they understand how to ensure that women can participate and participate actively, that they can analyze things from a gender perspective, and that they have the tools necessary to be able to address things from a gender perspective. And then the issue of anti-corruption activities. Any anti-corruption activities need an explicit gender perspective to actually ensure that they're addressing the specific challenges that are being felt by women. We need to raise the understanding of public officials about corruption in the water sector and the impact on women around corruption. And then finally, we need to recognize that sextortion is a specific form of corruption that affects women and girl children in particular, and it needs to be recognized in legislation, in monitoring, and integrity and accountability initiatives. And I think with that, that's the whistle-stop tour around gender and water and sanitation.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a very comprehensive presentation. I would encourage our audiences that as this webinar is also just not about us without you, we would request you to ask questions, open ideas and thoughts, so that we can understand what the feeling is from your end, and we can take this discussion forward as well outside of the webinar arena. I want to now call Alison Merchant from the OGP. She's going to talk to us, and she's going to tell us about the gender and the landscape of the Open Government Partnership. Alison Merchant is the Senior Gender Advisor for the Open Government Partnership, where she manages the gender thematic work and the Feminist Open Government Initiative. As a partnership of various organizations, the Feminist Open Government Initiative uses research and action to encourage governments to create commitments that advance gender equality and better governance through increased transparency, participation, accountability, and government responses. So with that, I hand it over to Alison Merchant. Alison, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. And thank you to Barbara for providing such a thoughtful overview of why bringing a gender perspective to water and sanitation is so critical. Here at the OGP support unit, we are thinking about ways to bring this expertise into our work in more ambitious and transformative ways. Open government and platforms like the OGP provide immense potential for governments and civil society to work together to improve gender responsive reforms around the world. We've seen really very promising transparency and accountability reforms on gender equality priorities in the past few years through these collaborative efforts, building on strong partnerships with many of you, as well as learnings from the Feminist Open Government Initiative. But we know we've only scratched the surface of how these cross-sector initiatives can collectively champion ambitious reforms to close economic, resource, and social gender gaps. Natural resource governance, including water and sanitation, are areas that are ripe for growth. Kanika will go into specific water commitments and dig into that in detail, but we thought it would be helpful to include a quick bird's eye view of gender in OGP commitments for the overall context as well. So with that, we'll go to the next slide and share just a couple of quick statistics. Overall, throughout the partnership, 41 members, so governments in particular, have made 127 commitments on gender to date. Gender is the second fastest growing area for OGP action plans, and one way to really recognize the uptick in the recognition around how critical this agenda is that there are currently 28 members implementing 82 commitments in 2018 and 2019 action plans. So the bulk of the existing commitments were really in the last few years. Natural resource governance in particular has been a longstanding integration into OGP's work, but bringing that gender perspective specifically is still relatively new. Within the overall kind of universe of gender and natural resources, we see 3 commitments on extractives industry through partners like EITI, 3 commitments on water and sanitation, as well as 6 on environment and climate, generally speaking. So when we think about opportunities to advance gender throughout open government work, there are three broad entry points I would urge us to consider as part of our water and sanitation reforms. And I'll just very quickly go through these, and then happily we'll follow up with folks separately afterwards. So first is thinking about inclusive co-creation. So how do we make the process of co-creating reforms more inclusive? And that one way to do that is through proactive outreach and engagement with government ministries or departments who are tasked with gender or inclusion. Certainly, there's many times those different government ministries are not necessarily connected to each other, and thinking about connecting with other resource management ministries. And so that's one proactive way to do that, as well as thinking about bringing in very specific gender organizations into the conversation. And so thinking about women land rights defenders and environmental activists who can really speak to those agendas. A second way, or second kind of entry point, is thinking about gender mainstreaming. And so that can be gender analysis of action plans overall, as well as commitments. And thinking about specific tactics like gender budgeting, as Barbara mentioned, as well as thinking about gender disaggregated data. So how do we look at some of these non-gender specific commitments, but understand them through that gender lens by the kind of data that we're collecting and analyzing. And tomorrow we'll talk about indicators as well later that are some ways of really tracking where and how we are affecting different communities. And we have some good examples of this through Kenya and looking at open contracting and bringing women and youth into public procurement, as well as Côte d'Ivoire looking at participatory budgeting. So those are some ways you can bring specific communities into broader conversations. And then last, looking at gender-specific commitments. Certainly when it comes to natural resource governance, there are so many ways, as Barbara mentioned, that women, gender communities, specific indigenous minority communities are very directly impacted by access to water and sanitation issues. And so thinking about what are some specific interventions that are needed to close gaps that disproportionately impact women or other key communities, and how do you design some reforms specifically around those areas. And so a couple of examples from this community as well is looking at Germany, who was monitoring women's leadership in public and private sector and using that data to then inform a law. We also see this in governments using international protocols like CEDAW, as we've seen in Sri Lanka, to connect that to the open government platform and to ensure that there is cross-population of CEDAW reporting within the open government structures as well, and so that those are reinforcing. So with that, I know that's a lot of information quickly, but there's some really good things ahead. So with those overall categories and tactics in mind, I'll turn it over to Kanika to share more on the specific water and sanitation commitments, and then look forward to having a very rich conversation. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Alison, for a wonderful presentation, and perhaps we can also share the link to the gender fact sheet, which is very comprehensive, and it puts all the information pretty well for people who are interested on the topic of gender-specific commitments in the OGP realm. I'm going to call on the next speaker, our last speaker of session 1, Kanika Thakkar, and she's the gender equality focal point at the Stockholm International Water Institute, or CV. And she provides guidance to staff on how gender equality can be mainstreamed. She hosts regular trainings and informal discussion points to keep the gender conversation going. Kanika comes to this role with more than 10 years of experience in program implementation and working in water resources management and WASH. Currently, Kanika supports work at the intergovernmental, national and subnational scales, as well as works in humanitarian WASH with the International Federation of the Red Cross. Kanika is going to present to us recommendations which will strengthen the capacity of countries and other actors, including actors at the city level, when developing commitments and implementing them. Kanika.
Thank you very much, Tasneem, and thank you also to Katrina for your help today. And I'd like to, I need to Got my slides going here. So as Tasneem said, I'm Kanika Takar from the Stockholm International Water Institute, and one of my roles with them is to be our gender equality focal point. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to integrate the gender priorities into some of the WASH commitments. These are just an entry point into this discussion. CWE is going to continue to build on this body of work and this knowledge in the coming months. And I'd like to, really try in my presentation to build on some of the excellent and informative presentations from Barbara and Allison, who have really nicely kind of laid the groundwork for what I'm going to be talking about today. I would like to try to focus on how we can use the co-creation process and the commitments themselves to further ensure transparent, accountable, participatory, and of course, gender-sensitive WASH. We're also going to talk about how we can be more specific and deliberate in our commitments in order to ensure that our actions are meaningful and deliver on our intended outcomes. And it's really important in this discussion that we don't simply focus on the end goal, but we also talk about the process of reaching that desired outcome. We can't just will gender equality into WASH. It really comes from an ongoing and renewed commitment. So in preparation for today, I wanted to do a quick analysis of where gender has been featured in the 65 WASH and sanitation commitments that have been made to date. So from the 65 commitments, I've seen that 2 commitments mention gender and/or gender equality. 3 commitments expressly mention participation of women, which is a very important step towards achieving gender equality. And 3 commitments mention women's agencies among their supporting actors. And this, particularly this last item that I've mentioned there, it could be much higher because we don't always explicitly mention women or gender in the name of our organizations, but this is kind of an indication to us that gender equality is kind of being lost or forgotten about in this process, and we need to have renewed commitment and be really specific about what we're after. So at CWE, we have recognized that gender equality is key to achieving sustainable water governance. And rather than having only specific areas of work dedicated to improving gender equality, we've actively worked to mainstream or include gender equality into everything that we do. And that can feel like a huge undertaking. But what we're trying to do is build on our existing work and find easier entry points for activities that can deliver gender equal outcomes. Gender mainstreaming does not need to be difficult, but it does need to be deliberate and intentional. And if the previous slide tells us anything, it's that we're not being deliberate or forceful enough with gender in our WASH commitments. Being clear about our goals or what inclusivity looks like is a huge step towards actually achieving it. Finally, gender mainstreaming or including gender can't just happen at part of the process. It has to happen at every stage, from planning and implementation through to monitoring and resourcing. Small but deliberate steps should be taken at every phase. So in today's presentation, I'm going to illustrate how a similar approach to inclusion and mainstreaming can be applied to existing and new commitments from the co-creation process through to implementation and beyond. So it's important that we start off right, and this means having an inclusive co-creation process for WASH commitments. And Allison did speak about this quite a bit, so I'm going to try to not go over as much, try to not say everything that she said. But what we want to ensure is that participants in the co-creation process represent our populations and their needs, which means striving for strong representation of women and gender minorities. It's also incredibly important that when we exactly what Allison said earlier, that one woman or one non-binary individual does not represent all, and as such, we need to strive to have participants from different backgrounds, but more importantly, in our case, we need to make sure that we have participants who have varying WASH needs and WASH access. And women's groups and LGBTQ plus groups were very well highlighted by Allison as strong advocates and partners, but we also need to make sure that they're not our only partners in gender equality, particularly as WASH engages so many different kinds of actors. So I really strongly suggest that you request all of your partners or your supporting organizations to send gender diverse representation to meetings and have at least a male and female associate work with you on the co-creation process and the commitments as they're delivered. And also ask if these organizations have gender focal points that can be engaged. Gender focal points are becoming increasingly common in the WASH sector, particularly among development agencies, water utilities, and in water and natural resources ministries. Sometimes getting women and gender minorities into the room isn't enough, particularly when we're talking about things that can be uncomfortable, such as toilets and menstrual hygiene management. We have to make sure that we have the right conditions to allow people to fully engage. And so sometimes we might need to consider that individual or segregated consultations are the way that you can get a full WASH picture. So make sure that you consider your audience. And finally, take attendance. We'll talk a little bit later about indicators and the importance of data, but knowing who is in the room or who you've been engaging with in that co-creation process and how many men and women and non-binary individuals there are can be a really helpful step in building allies and know where you need to strengthen your engagement. In my brief review of the WASH commitments, I noted that many of the commitments mentioned community involvement. And this kind of language is often used with very good intention to state that we want engagement that reflects the community. However, these kinds of blanket statements can also result in gender blindness. We too often take for granted that women are part of the community and forget that they are in fact 49.5% of the community based on global population according to the World Bank. This gender blindness often results in women and gender minorities being left out entirely due to lack of engagement or underlying barriers that prevent their participation. Even in the best of situations, gender equal participation requires specific attention. Don't take it for granted. This comes back to our need to be very clear in what success looks like and what our goals are. When it comes to gender, we need to be explicit and say what we mean. And so on this next slide, what I've done is tried to do a quick overview and taken some excerpts from WASH commitments, and I'm going to show you a few examples that how with a little bit of tweaking of a commitment, we can get better gendered outcomes. So here the commitment says that the sustainability of projects must be taken into account through the involvement of the community in the maintenance and management of both projects and infrastructure. This is an example of a really great and strong commitment that really calls on the community involvement to ensure accountability. And this is what we want to see. However, without being deliberate about the community includes both men, women, and gender minorities, what experience tells us is that one of these groups is going to be outweighing the others. And more often than not, it's typically that we have a lot of men participating and very little participation from women and gender minorities, which results in critical information about times and quality of service being missed as women and men are engaging in WASH infrastructure in very different ways and at very different times of the day. By rephrasing the commitment slightly, we can ensure that the community is better reflected in the involvement, and meaningful feedback from genders is a priority. So here in the first revision, I've included, rather than saying the involvement of the community, I've been specific to say that it requires the involvement of women and men from the community. So we're being very specific as to who the community is. In the second commitment, we include, our second revision, I've tweaked it in a different way to say that it requires the involvement of the members of the community, but with special attention to women and gender minorities. Again, this kind of elevates that we need to put specific attention and interest into these areas. In the second commitment that I'm going to review, we're looking at an element that's really common across commitments and something that's, would seem to be really strong. It's the access to up-to-date, complete information on drinking water supply and sanitation services. And at first read, we might believe that this is completely gender neutral. However, it's really important to take into account how women and men access information, and even more importantly, how this information is going to be collected. The commitment eventually goes on to say that the information platform that's being talked about is going to be used for allowing monitoring, planning, scheduling, and coordination of WASH activities, and that this information should be both reported on and accessed by local governments and citizens. On the face of it, it sounds really great. We are putting the power into the hands of the people, and globally, there is a huge push towards online tools for reporting because it can be the most cost-effective and promotes a participatory approach. However, access to online tools and resources is not equal across genders. Women and girls make up 2/3 of the world's illiterate population, meaning that reports and written media, such as reports even online, are far less accessible to women. Women also have less access to financial resources, which in turn can mean that they have less access to smartphones or computers to access information online and participate in reporting. So in this revision, what we've done is we want to make sure I hope you're all still seeing my presentation. Yes. So in this presentation, revision, what we want to do is we want to bring to light these inequalities and hold ourselves accountable to them. So the commitment remains the same, but we add on at the end that the reporting on and access to the data is equally done by women and men. Or in the second revision, we include that we need to take into account the difficulties women and gender minorities may face in reporting on and accessing information. This is really about bringing it to the surface and making sure that our actions that follow up these commitments do so with this in mind. With any good commitment, outcomes must be measurable, and evidence and data are the backbone of any good policy. And both Barbara and Allison both talked about sex disaggregated data. It's critically important. When we take time to acknowledge and measure how women and gender minorities are engaging with or being affected by commitments, we gain deeper insights into otherwise hidden or ignored barriers and motivators. The simple act of counting how many LGBTQ+ community members are involved in a consultation or estimating the percentage of women involved in a monitoring activity helps us to recognize implicit bias in our commitments and activities. By taking time and effort to be aware, we make ourselves open to understanding what might be preventing women and gender minorities from engaging. Low numbers in these areas can also help motivate better policy to address these challenges and help us take active steps to achieving gender equal outcomes. I also really strongly encourage you to, when you use indicators, to set targets. Having a goal gives you something to work towards and makes your indicators more meaningful. But it's also important to, while you should be ambitious, be reasonable. Achieving targets that are achievable targets are far more likely to be realized. And so if you start from a place of having no female engagement to wanting to have 50% female engagement within a year, that might be something that you're just setting yourself up to fail. So make sure you think about it. And really a fantastic resource that I encourage you to have a look at is the World Water Assessment Program's Gender and Water Toolkit. This toolkit was recently relaunched in 2019 and has a huge set of indicators, questionnaires, guidance, methodologies, interview questions, how to use different kinds of questions in different scenarios. So I've included a link to the toolkit at the end of my presentation, and I really encourage you to download it and take a closer look at it. So here's an example of how we can use indicators to track the progress of our goals, of our commitments. So in this example from previously, we talked about involving of members of the communities with special attention to women and gender minorities in the maintenance and management of projects and infrastructures. Some simple, relatively easy indicators to include here that can tell a big story is the percentage of community members engaged in planning activities that are women or gender minority, the percentage of community members engaged in maintenance activities that are women and gender minorities, number of women, men, and gender minorities who have received training, and number of female, male, and gender minority project managers. These are, if the numbers are low in these cases, we should be asking ourselves, why is it the case, and make just adjustments to better accommodate participation from underrepresented groups. I also really strongly encourage you to put the indicators right into your commitment. This is the best, I would say, the best way of taking things forward. It's a really strong way of making sure that you're holding yourselves accountable. And so you can further strengthen your commitments in this way. This is one example of how this can be done using the previous tweaked example by including a target percentage of population to be achieved within a specific amount of time. So the inclusion here is with the target of X percentage of involved community members being female or of a gender minority by year Y. And as we know, good commitments should be time-bound. So be ambitious, be reasonable, and be specific. This next slide is a little bit outside of what maybe I should have been talking about in this presentation, but I think it is of critical importance. Mainstreaming does not need to be hard, but it doesn't come without costs. And the process of monitoring indicators, addressing barriers, and ensuring women and gender minorities are engaged and equally provided for takes resources. Like any part of a project, if resources are not allocated from the start, then these deliverables are typically not achieved. Gender responsive or gender sensitive budgeting, as both Allison and Barbara have mentioned, have been advocated for since the 1980s, and it looks like, and they look to achieve gender equality by focusing on how how resources are allocated to ensure gender sensitive outcomes. In essence, if we want to have gender equal outcomes, then we need to have a budget that also reflects this. In South Korea, gender-sensitive budgeting was actually applied to modify their Act on Public Toilets and allocate more resources to building toilets for men on the differentiated needs of men and women. This type of budgeting essentially reserves funds to ensure that women and gender minorities are best served. Here, I've just included the list of some of the resources that I consulted in this process. And I really encourage you to take a deep dive into there. I've also included several resources on gender budgeting and costing, just because it can be a bit of a complex issue and something that's hard to understand. But I do hope that this was helpful for you. And I'm always available to be contacted should you have questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kadika.
We had a bit of a deep dive into, okay, how can you take commitments and make it a bit more explicit and show that those gender aspects and, more importantly, gender indicators, as well as gender budgeting. So we would now like to jump into a very short session, 10 minutes, on questions and answers. And some of you have already posted your questions. We have captured them, but please continue to post them in the chat box. So there was a question from Nayeli, I think from Mexico, as well from Myra, which is addressed to Barbara. One, talking about information related to extortion and any policies, and as well as to Barbara, how can women actively engage in the water governance? So Barbara, can you just quickly address these questions?
Briefly, I have put into the chat box a recent publication from Transparency International on the issue of sextortion. It's not specific to the water and sanitation sector, but it's recent and it's good. I think the real challenge around sextortion is that it is not widely talked about, not recognized, and in many cases not recognized in legal frameworks and not recognized as a corruption issue. So it needs to be better researched, better understood, and put higher on the agenda. In terms of the issue of how women can participate in water governance, I think that a lot of the stuff that Tanika went through was quite useful in that regard, so I'm going to be very brief. I think that the bottom line is it depends on the specific context, the country, where in the country, and one has to understand the context first and work from that context. But essentially, I would talk about, I would think that there's an issue of education and awareness, making people recognize that the needs of women are different and therefore women should be involved. There's a need for people to actually organize and mobilize. These things don't happen without actually organized and structured activity. Organize, mobilize, build coalitions, link to other sectors and processes where things are happening, build, for example, on the gender focal point, if there is one, on commitments in CEDAW, and make links with women's groups, with Ministry of Women, build coalitions and actually push to demand participation. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. So because of timing, I will just take one more question just to mention, Albert, that I have seen the question you posed on indicators relevant to WASH. In the next session, we will discuss a little bit more about specific indicators, not specifically to WASH, but maybe it's something we can further dive in the next set or take forward in discussions outside of the webinar. But the next question is to Alison. So Alison, there's been posed a question, has there already been a best practice from among the OGP member countries on water as to their action plans?
Thanks for that. I think, Maya, that's a great question. Certainly there are a collection of best practices from across our partners, and many of them are listed here as far as the overall approaches. As far as gender in the water commitments, I think there's a lot of room for growth. And so certainly part of what we're hoping comes out of this project, really championed by the water community of practice, is some of these best practice guidances, so that we do have a bit of a more systematic recommendation to governments, whether local or national, and partners on how to engage.
Thank you, Alison. I think we'll move on because we're also keeping a close watch on the time. We've noted your questions, we've noted your comments, and we will figure out a way to come back to you and have this conversation over. I think we should move on, if it's all right, with the session 2, that is the panel discussion. Just to introduce what the panel discussion is about, we'll start by understanding the water commitment from Mexico and what the gender lens has been and is. The discussion will pan out to how gender needs to be made an integral part, and from design to delivery, exactly what we saw in the presentations, but just having a much more meaningful, more interesting conversation around that, and you're listening to this from the grassroots perspective. We have 10 minutes again at the end of the session for taking questions. Let's see how that works out. The session will be moderated by Barbara Schreiner, and I would like to introduce our new speakers. So we have joining us Carla Flores. She works with Cartocritica and researches on issues of transparency, accountability within the framework of the defense of territory. Cartocritica is an independent, non-profit Mexican organization promoting transparency and public access to geo-referenced information. Together with 3 other organizations, Cartocritica has built an index of transparency of natural resources, including water, which was a part of the 4th Open Government Action Plan. There's also Tamar Hayrikian, and she's a managing partner at Técnicas Rudas. Thank you, Tamar, for joining us. It's also a Mexican-based organization that contributes to social movements in human rights defense through strategic research, technology, creative alliancing, and organizational strengthening. Prioritizing grassroots initiatives, their approach integrates an intersectional gender lens and also digital security. So with that introduction, I would request Barbara Schreiner to take over the moderation of the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Taz, and welcome to Carla and Tamar, Alison and Kanika. I'm going to begin with some questions. I'm going to start with a question to Carla, but I'm going to request the panel members to please be as tight on time as possible, because we would like to have some time left for people to answer some questions at the end of this. So Carla, can you please briefly introduce the Mexican water commitment to us and tell us from your perspective, what are the challenges that you faced in incorporating a gender lens into the establishment of a commitment? And what is the role of gender in the implementation of the commitment?
Thanks, Barbara. Hello to everyone. I'm aware you that I'm going to read this because I don't speak fluent English, so sorry about that. In Mexico, as you know, since the end of 2018, we have new president, new administration, and new OGP coordinating committee. So the new Ministry of the Civil Service contact members of civil society and academia to review the most relevant issues on their agendas and consider them for the future commitments. At the same time, a group of CSOs, that is Causa Natura, Reforestamos México, Cartocrítica, and the Fund for Environmental Communication and Education, we're already working on the design of a Natural Resources Transparency Index, a tool to measure transparency of public information regarding the management of forest, water, and fishing resources. So we take advantage of that convergence and reached an agreement to incorporate the index in the 4th OGP National Action Plan under the commitment number 10. This index is based on 3 types of transparency. The active one, that is the info required by law. The proactive, it's the info voluntary, useful, and available online. And the reactive is the info that is requested by the users. And these 3 transparencies were addressed for data related to permits and concessions, subsidies, and inspection and surveillance of the duties. Mandatory, necessary, and request information was identified for each sector as variables through several methods such as reviewing legal documentation, participative workshops, and surveys. Cartocrítica also identified georeferenced information related to these variables. This commitment covers 2 main developments: the implementation of recommendations from the transparency assessments carried out through the index, and the creation of a participatory mechanism called transparency monitoring groups to follow up on the progress of these implementations. Currently, we are in the evaluation stage of the variables. I hope that answered the first question. For the second question, unfortunately, during the elaboration of the index, the gender perspective was not incorporated as a specific element to be addressed, which could have been because many factors, as that the main objective was merely to diagnose access to resource information, or that each of the organizations established the agenda according to their expertise, not being the gender perspective one of them. So maybe I can identify that one of the challenge is to include the items, like Kanika already told us, to pay special attention to women and gender minorities. So it might seem like we haven't faced challenges yet, but the index also involves the perspective of vulnerable groups with direct links to the resources, who are defenders of territories and the main users of the data, in particular women, indigenous people, and small-scale producers. For these, participatory workshops for each sector were planned, but more with an intersectional idea of vulnerability. The bad news is that the water workshop was scheduled for last April, and with the coronavirus issue, well, it obviously had to be postponed. However, the forest and fishing colleagues did manage to carry them out. Fishing sector told us that in their field workshop, women were almost 50% of participants, which is an excellent news, since the goal was not included in the strategy at the beginning. The forest team made one workshop aimed at women, but they tell us that only 2 of them participated because they were the only ones with permission of their husbands. It's very sad. So for now, we can only have numerical data regarding to the participation of women in the workshops. And for the third question about on the gender role in the implementation of the commitment, since the experience we have had, I consider 3 possible opportunity areas. The first one is the need to include items on gender perspective issues as a cross-cutting element for the implementation of the commitment. This means to synergize with experts on the subject and promote their participation on monitoring groups, like the co-creation process you already have talked about. During the monitoring group sessions, promote gender inclusion practices and raise awareness about women's different information needs, given that water aspects in Mexico are generally perceived as a matter only of distribution and sanitation, of water engineering, which for many years in this country has been a primarily masculine environment, rather than as a natural resource with which wives, mothers, daughters, and grandmothers are in greater contact to carry out the tasks of family care and home management. And the third one is to promote a future commitment. This is identifying the information and its transparency about differential impacts on women of the extractive industries on the water resource. I said this final issue because Cartocrítica is right now a civil society representative on a standard that is called Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, 80. And in the 2019 standard, it already includes gender perspective, and it could be great to look forward for a synergy between 80 and OGP. And that's all, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Carla, and thank you for raising some very interesting ideas and challenges, including your last point about the possibility of bringing in experiences from outside of the water sector, which is always an interesting possibility that exists. But thank you, some very useful experience from the ground in terms of the challenges of getting gender incorporated into a process. I'm now going to call on Tamar. Tamar, you have been, Técnicas Rudas has been involved in an applied research exercise which aimed to explore the potential of using gender indicators in the creation and implementation of OGP commitments and making them more inclusive. Can you tell us a little bit about the key findings from your research and what learnings have come out of it that we could consider in the water and sanitation?
Thanks so much, Barbara. I've really been looking forward to this opportunity to share research findings. Before I answer your question, though, I do just want to acknowledge that this research was only possible because of the frontline land rights organizations and local communities and researchers from Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, and of course the Feminist Open Government Initiative, who all contributed in numerous ways to the work. So a big thank you to them. And on the question of what our research findings were of this year-long applied research project, there were several components to the research, but I would say it maybe comes down to 3 key contributions. The first, a systematized list organized by human rights categories of gender-sensitive indicators relevant for natural resource governance in general. The second contribution could be a simple guide, or it is a simple guide or a series of guides for creating gender-sensitive results and gender-sensitive impact indicators for natural resource governance commitments. And the third are basically the conclusions of a participatory multi-country quasi-experiment that simulated the co-creation and evaluation processes, where the essential question was this, basically, how do open government commitments change when we use gender indicators to create and to evaluate natural resource governance commitments? So here the driving hypothesis is pretty much exactly what Kanika mentioned in her presentation, that gender mainstreaming need not be difficult, but it does need to be deliberate and explicit to work. And we thought that maybe using gender indicators could help accomplish that. So since I only have a few minutes, going to highlight exactly on this third question, what we found as some of the answers that are less center stage, but no less critical and no less actionable. And so firstly, the overwhelming majority of observations from frontline land rights defenders of the differential impact of natural resource governance decisions, in other words, decisions about how natural resources are exploited or safeguarded, is connected to the human rights impacts of the extractive industries. Many of these impacts are relatively obvious, perhaps, or even intuitive, and also well documented. For example, right to health, right to food, right to a healthy environment, labor rights, and of course, the right to water and sanitation. However, we also discovered that using gender indicators and undertaking the commitment co-creation process with a feminist perspective brings to the forefront issues that we actually rarely see in conversations, let alone written down in action plans on open natural resource governance. And one of these issues that I'd like to highlight right now is violence. So here across the board, where there's resource extraction, we're seeing an increase in the threat of physical violence, or in rights terms, and violations of liberty, security of person, security of communities. This appears to be ubiquitous. So this includes issues like forced displacement, forced labor, domestic violence, sexual violence, also what Barbara already talked about more, sexual extortion, human trafficking, militarization and intimidation and attacks of community leaders and land rights defenders, as well as others. So there's one immediate takeaway, is that natural resource governance strategies really do need to start dealing with this reality head on. And a separate finding, but also of course very much related, and zooming in here on water and sanitation, here we see a very dangerous chain reaction of impacts. For example, a mining project has a dramatic effect on a community's ability to exercise its right to water, both due to pollution and scarcity, which has cross-cutting consequences by affecting the health of the entire community, which then disproportionately burdens women due to traditional roles as caregivers, and thus in turn also lead to a drop in their ability to participate in the labor market, and in turn leads to a reduction in livelihood and further deterioration in access to health. And meanwhile, the reduction in availability of clean water sources, that same issue, original issue, augments the amount of time dedicated to household chores and also in supporting agricultural work, further reducing time available for rest, for education, and for remunerated work. And the way we find all of this is by using gender indicators to help us make these observations. So I know that that was a pretty dense response to the question, but I do think that it illustrates what using gender indicators can accomplish, which is make visible what has, for many, been invisible up until now, assign value to what is normally taken for granted, and put at center stage issues that have traditionally been viewed as secondary or only indirectly related to natural resource governance. And finally, it's serving as guideposts for designing much more inclusive and impactful natural resource governance strategies that do have, maybe different to what we're accustomed to, respecting and protecting human rights as one of their primary objectives.
Thanks, Tamar. That was very interesting, very useful, and fairly sobering in terms of the making what some of the invisible is that gets made visible when you start looking at gender disaggregated information. But that was extremely useful. Thank you very much. I wonder if you could just follow up very briefly. Talk to us a little bit about what you think some of the common hits and misses are when working around gender in action plans. What works, what doesn't work? What?
Yeah, definitely. So one part of the research process was looking through past national action plans in Peru and Colombia and in Mexico with specific natural resource governance commitments. And there what we found was that natural resource governance commitments tend to fall into one of two baskets. One, opening data, creating digital information platforms, and the other is in creating forums, spaces, programs that foster inclusion and citizen participation. So I think that alone would be a hit, because actually, as our own research independently found, one of the key rights categories where we found that gender indicators are crucial are in the right to participate in public affairs and public decision making, and the right to access information. So that exactly mirrors what we see happening on natural resource governance commitments. But where they start to fall short is in the details. In the details, exactly what, again, Kanika mentions, which is in making the gender targets, the gender sensitivity, deliberate and explicit. So, for example, using the guidelines that we created as part of this research that I alluded to earlier, we found some of the more common misses are, and this goes beyond gender indicators but would be essential for making them work, is the absence of baseline assessments. Baseline assessments that detect the difference of the current situation between men and women and gender minorities vis-a-vis whatever issue is being dealt with in the commitment. On the data platform, creating digital information platforms front, on those types of commitments, there are common misses is that more generally, an emphasis on technological solutions that actually, without incorporating the gender lens, the gender indicators, risk actually worsening the gender gap in terms of access to information. And again, in those types of technology-based solutions, the absence of milestones related to testing those technology-based solutions with the different populations and gender minorities, as well as the absence of capacity building being built into those the action plan for implementing the commitments, which ultimately would help overcome those gaps in access to knowledge and tools for using online information platforms that I think Kanika also had mentioned. And also a very practical missed opportunity, and this is very much related to what the work that's been done on gender sensitive budgeting. There's an absence of what we're calling enabling conditions for participation of traditionally marginalized groups and gender minorities, including considerations as basic as budget for travel, compensation for time invested in meetings, and for the cost of caring for dependents, taking into account that women tend to be the primary caregivers and for younger and older dependents in the household. But just to sandwich that with another positive development, I just think it's very important to acknowledge a small but crucial step that was taken in Mexico with the 4th National Action Plan. In spite of the challenges that Carla mentioned, which I think are very, very real, as of this National Action Plan, every commitment in the National Action Plan includes an answer to the question, how does this commitment incorporate a gender perspective? Now, that may be a small step, but I think what it opens up is the opportunity for the next step, which could be to do exactly what Kanika recommends, which is to incorporate gender sensitivity and gender indicators directly into the language of the commitment for future National Action Plan.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Tamar. Some encouraging stuff there and some very useful. It's always useful to learn from what doesn't work as well as what does work. But clearly some hope that there is stuff that actually can be done that does work. Just to close off the panel discussion, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just very quickly talk to us about what the wide range of partners of support can bring, how they can bring gender to the center stage in the water sector. And you've each got absolutely not more than 2 minutes because we're running out of time. So Carla, if you would like to start on that question. 2 minutes, please.
Yes, I think I could do better than that. But well, hoping not to sound repetitive because all of you already mentioned it, I think that the priorities are to promote gender transversality, this cross-cutting factor, in water and in all other topics of OGP, because at least in Mexico 4th National Plan, it isn't present like a single or individual commitment, but it could be a cross-cutting commitment of all in all other topics. And other opportunity area is to identify vulnerabilities differentiated by the lack of access to water, and identify difficulties in access to data and informative needs of the different gender minorities, and encourage the dissemination of information on water specifically to women. This is briefly because women have different needs to information to manage their territory and the resources they're in contact to. I hope I'll be clear about that because my English is very bad. If not, Tamara could help me to translate it. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Carla, and I think you were very clear and your English is extremely good. Thank you very much. Tamar, would you like to take your 2 minutes?
So yeah, just to continue on Carla's points, I think just to start, it's important to recognize we don't have to wait for sweeping reforms or for the next national action plan to start making changes, to start using gender indicators. That's also what's so fun and what's so practical about them as a tool. They can be incorporated from the get-go in implementation. And as Carla had mentioned in her presentation, there's a lot of expertise in the community that can help guide government and civil society. So there's an important opportunity for collaboration. But of course, through it all, I think we should remember that there's still a fair amount to learn for all of us, including those of us that may be seen as gender experts. So the research and experimentation and knowledge sharing should continue to be an integral part of whatever we embark on next. And as far as OGP on the international level and on the country level is concerned, I think that there are 3 key moments where we can start to plan and integrate gender indicators. So during co-creation, as part of the processes, then at the conclusion of the National Action Plan, specifically in the self-assessment and in the independent reporting mechanisms methodologies, and ultimately as well, eventually in impact evaluations. And we should think of indicators not just as evaluation tools, but also as guideposts that can help us from the moment of co-creation ensure that the impact we're trying to achieve and the path we're taking to getting there is taking into account gender and gender minorities.
Thank you very much. That was great. Alison, would you like to put in your 2 minutes worth, please?
I would indeed, thank you. A couple of things certainly across these presentations, and I think a lot of the country research we've heard so far, that I think would be really impactful in terms of increasing gender perspectives in the open government platforms. Is really, I think it's come through multiple times in this presentation, but very specific outreach and engagement throughout the co-creation process is critical. And so thinking about bringing in those really vital voices who are on the front lines of this work and making sure that they're informing the process of co-creation is critical. I think something else that I'm taking away from this is the need to really unpack language in draft commitments and be very specific about the needs, the indicators, and the stakeholders. So not just saying community engagement or citizen engagement, but really thinking about the specific individuals who will be impacted in shaping these different commitments. So there's a better opportunity to have some accountability in those creation. And I think lastly, to Tamar's point, building in some baseline data collection and analysis to really understand where and how these commitments are taking forward some of these key values and key needs for certain communities. So I think those are 3 I would call out on my side.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for being efficient with time. Kanika, can I hand over to you as the last person on the panel?
Yes, absolutely, and I'll try to be even better with time. you know, I'd like to speak from the perspective of the community of practice that Celie and others are involved with here. And, you know, we're really taking this topic very seriously, and it's even resulted in this webinar because we understand that partners are craving this information and we want to actively build the conversation around it. We've also additionally been building knowledge products to build better support for partners, and including a step-by-step guide for cities that want to have their water commitments in their action plans, and then we'll feature within there a specific chapter on recommendations from a gendered lens. So continuing to provide support through knowledge products. And then lastly, we continue to offer support through the help desk. And this is really a place where you can come with some of the questions they've seen in the chat today. These are great questions to be sending through to the help desk, where we can offer guidance and support during the co-creation process and the implementation of commitments. So we really encourage you to contact us at wateropengovernment@CUE.org, and I'll put that in the chat as well. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks very much, Karnika. I would just like to say thank you very much to the panelists. I think it's been a very interesting discussion and very rooted and practical. And I think there's been a lot of information that all of us as participants in this can learn from and pick up on. We're virtually out of time. I'm not sure that we're going to have much time for questions. Are there any specific burning questions that somebody wants to type into the chat box? We can try and take that. But otherwise, if there are no specific questions, I would just like to say that I think this community of practice has clearly brought together a bunch of people to talk about what is a very important issue and to share very practically how we can go about trying to address it and trying to ensure that the issue of gender is built into OGP action plans around water and sanitation. Sometimes I feel a bit like I've been working in the water sector for a long time, and it distresses me to what extent gender still needs to be put on the agenda in many places, and how we still need to struggle for it. But I do think that there's a real opportunity here and some very good support systems in place through the OGP and through this community of practice in order to support people in really trying to take forward the issue of gender in terms of water and sanitation and commitments. And so I think just then in closing, to say thank you very much to everybody who's participated this afternoon. I think that a number of contacts have been put into the chat box for people to follow up with, both in terms of further information. If you scroll through the chat box, you'll see that there's a wealth of information there that has been put in as links, as well as specific contacts that people can follow up with if they need more information or want to follow up with. And so on that note, I would just like to say thank you very much to everybody, and to say let's continue and carrying forward this very important conversation and supporting each other in finding ways of addressing these issues, learning from each other, and building a much stronger program of action around gender, water and sanitation through the OGP. So thank you very much to everybody, and I wish you all to stay safe